destruir o nosso território.
Deforestation disrupts the water cycle here, which the health of the forest relies on. At the same time, global warming is further weakening the Amazon, with longer dry seasons, record-breaking temperatures, and more extreme droughts.
Na Amazônia, são discutidos, fala sobre mudança climática. Muitos estão botando a sua vida para salvar a Amazônia. Se hoje a floresta está queimando, não é por nossa culpa. É por isso que quando falamos da mudança climática, vamos falar de nós, vamos falar dos povos, vamos falar daqueles que estão protegendo, ambientalistas, ativistas, vamos falar das pessoas que estão morando dentro da Amazônia.
Climate change and habitat destruction are impacting the health of both the Amazon and the indigenous people who call it home. Some waterways have also become toxic due to the runoff of mercury used to extract gold in illegal mines. If ingested through eating contaminated fish, it can have devastating impacts on the health of local communities.
O nosso rio aqui na frente, né, é uma fonte de alimento, é uma estrada onde a gente vai e volta. Ela está doente, ela está pedindo socorro.
The Munduruku are using drones to capture footage of illegal mines and working with the Public Prosecutor's Office to take action against those responsible. They also post their videos to thousands of followers on social media to expose the urgency of their situation to the world. The destruction of their home is something that affects us all. Scientists fear we may be approaching a tipping point, beyond which the Amazon would rapidly degrade. If the carbon stored in the Amazon was released, it would drive warming across our planet. Changes of just a fraction of a degree could impact all of our health. Increases in extreme weather caused by climate change endanger lives and destroy people's homes and livelihoods. What happens to the Amazon is key to all of our futures. Indigenous peoples help to manage almost 25% of the total carbon stored above ground in the world's tropical forests. Alessandro and the Munduruku are on the front lines of this battle.
O meio ambiente sem os povos indígenas não é meio ambiente, porque nós somos uma conexão só. Nós somos única. Aonde existe floresta, existe povos, existe animais, existe planta, existe cura, existe vida. Eu amo a minha casa, eu amo o meu povo, eu amo o meu rio. Sempre estive e sempre continuarei a lutar e defender a Amazônia. Nós estamos lutando pelos nossos filhos, pela nossa vida, mas também para vocês, pelos filhos de vocês.
Thank you for watching that. I think it makes a good intro to the way in which we need to be thinking about the climate crisis, which is to understand its impact on human bodies and human health. It's been a bit of a missing part of the puzzle, I think, for quite a lot of the time that we've been built. We're at COP29, and it's been missing for a lot of those COPs. We often think about machines, we think about carbon molecules, we think about money, and in doing that, those are all very important parts of the puzzle, but in doing that we can sometimes forget the person, the people. For us at Wellcome, it's vital that we recognise and count and measure the impacts on human health of both climate change itself and the climate and the interventions we might take to tackle it. We think that's important because there's whole experiences and pain and also joy that is ignored by ignoring the element of health. And to do that, we like to mobilise science. And we want to mobilise science to understand health, to have greater health equity and climate justice. But we know to do that, we can't just we've got to question how we do science. We've got to do science in different ways to meet these challenges. And that includes thinking about how we bring in many other knowledge systems and how we work together to understand health. So it's not just one person's idea of health, it's really thinking about health for all, understood by all. And with that in mind, we have brought together a range of different speakers. We have two on that will be joining us virtually, one from Canada and one from London. And we have three in person. Thank you so much. I'm going to give a quick introduction to our panellists, and then I'm going to ask them an introduction question. Then they've got one each, and then we've got a final question. And then we've got some time, I hope, for questions from the audience. So here in the room, we have Marina Romanello, who is Executive Director of the Lancet Countdown. We have Cleo Nascimento, who is a biomedical scientist, and she's also the National Articulator for Engegamundo, a youth-led organisation that was set up in response to Rio 20, which is particularly exciting for me when we're thinking about the road to COP30, when we're thinking about a Brazilian COP. Brazil hasn't hosted the COP before, but they kicked us all off in Rio, and they did so many interesting things with Rio 20. Finally, in the room, we have Riel Umana, who is Papua New Guinea's Special Envoy for Climate and the Environment. And beaming in from other parts of the world, we have Hugh Sharma-Waddington, who is Assistant Professor at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, where he works on the Pathfinder project. And we have Maria Shallard, who is Director for Indigenous Research at the Canadian Climate Institute. I'm going to start with a question to all of you, and I think I'm going to start just in the order of people in the room, and then we'll go to the screen. And the first question is, we're getting to what we thought was going to be the end of COP, although it may run on for several more days, but we're kind of winding out the programme in the pavilions, and many of us will be starting to go home soon. It is that point where I think a lot of us start to really dive into some of the more depressing parts of climate change. It's the point where we think, all right, we've taken this step forward, but there are so many more steps ahead of us that we need to take, and it can feel quite overwhelming. So I just wanted to kick off with, more positively, what has been your highlight of COP29? If you have one, I hope you have one. Marina, if you could start.
Yeah, look, for me, coming to COP29 was first meeting again this community of climate change and health that has been now coming together for the second COP after the second health day, having that health day with commitments from the presidencies of previous and the upcoming COP to ensure continuity of our commitments and of our work towards ensuring that health is prominent within climate negotiations. And it has also been a great COP in terms of increasing the engagement of health within the negotiations themselves, particularly talking about the global goal on adaptation that has been discussed here and the technicalities of it, how we're going to measure and quantify effective progress towards adaptation, including for health. And the finance discussion that has going on with a lot of people mentioning that health has economic benefits, that investing in health is beneficial to the economy, that health co-benefits of climate action could bring a lot of economic benefits. So it has been a whole set of small things that added to this whole feeling that we're having a great momentum for health in this COP.
Thank you. I think I've definitely been following a lot of the climate and health space and recognise that too. But moving on to other bits, I mean, Cleo, what about you? If you got a highlight, can we pass them? Have you got the mic? You got the microphone. Thank you. Good. Yeah, I think it's on.
Hello?
Yes. Thank you.
Okay?
Yeah.
Okay. Hello, everyone. This is my first COP. I am an indigenous woman from Brazil and the Pernambuco state. And I will introduce me in English, but I feel more comfortable speaking Portuguese. So now I will speak in Português, ok? Então, pela minha perspectiva, enquanto primeira...
Well, from my point of view, because this is my first COP, number one,
enquanto primeira COP,
as the first COP, I was quite happy because I managed to find many indigenous people here. And for me, this was a very positive point based on COP30, because whereas a woman, indigenous women, research in the area of health, for example, I say this is a very positive point, given that we came to this COP to see to sort of create a continuity of the political incidents for COP30. And so this, in addition to a researcher, I am a doctor. I studied biomedicine, and I think that the health and climate for Indigenous people is very important. And I was brought up in a village, in a community, and the first COP, my impression was that I managed to find other people, Indigenous people here, who I could articulate this with Indigenous people from different countries, and we had a very strong articulation with Indigenous people, and so we could pass this on to COP30. So I believe that in relation to negotiations, I don't have a very good perspective, because I think that my organization, there were 12 of us, 4 is Indigenous, 4 Indigenous people, which is quite a quantity, but we don't have access to the ongoing negotiations, which is quite negative. And so I think that this was a very strong articulation and a positive in other senses. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Ruel, what about you? Do you have a highlight? Do you have a microphone? It's more to the point. You do. Good.
Hello. Yeah, thank you. My Portuguese is a bit rough, so I'll speak English. I think it's still early days. I think the highlight for me would be, firstly, as mentioned by the other colleagues, the inclusive nature of the process so far. I think it's good to be part of this community of practitioners, sharing our experiences, and of course charting the way forward to Brazil next year, engaging our different views, especially on an important topic and agenda with the nexus between climate and health. I think that the next point is the opening plenary. I think for me it was the first time to see the adoption of the carbon market framework, which is a first. I think that's positive, because as we all know, the multilateral process can be quite tricky sometimes. So I think that is a positive start. But I think for me, in closing, the key highlight would be seeing how the discussions around the NCQG discussions go far. Obviously, the science and the need for action to mobilize the support to the priorities. So fingers crossed our leaders reach a positive outcome in the coming hours / day or two. Thank you.
Yeah, it's a bit early to call any highlights maybe from that, but it's been incredible to watch. Over back in London, Hugh, what about you? I mean, how much of it have you been engaging with? Have you been watching the news out of it? Oh, I've got not Hugh. Okay. What about in Canada, Maria? How much of COP have you been able to engage with? Have you seen anything? Have you had any highlights? Or have you been keeping away from it?
No, I have been following along. It's been great to join remotely. I first just want to acknowledge I'm joining from unceded Comox territory in British Columbia, Canada. And thank you for having me. The highlights for me have been reading about the participation of Indigenous youth from around the world. There was one news article in particular that highlighted Indigenous youth's experiences and the impacts that they feel facing climate change. And I think it takes a lot of bravery to be in those spaces and have those conversations. So I really want to raise my hands to Indigenous youth around the world that are participating in events like COP. I was also very happy to see that there was a signed declaration to reduce methane and organic waste. Food production and waste is such a big concern around the world. So happy to see the emphasis on health, and I'm looking forward to the conversation today. Thanks.
Thank you. Yeah, the methane made a splash at COP29. I remember there was a pavilion asking people to have a methane moment, and I was worried that methane moment would go, but it seems to be continuing. Getting to a chance to maybe dive into a bit more detail with the different speakers. We don't have Hugh coming, is that right? A bit late. Okay, well, we can ask him his highlights when he arrives. Marina, I mean, you work in a scientific institution. You run the Lancet Countdown. How can greater integration of science and health evidence into the UNFCCC processes? I mean, you talked a bit about being able to see us in the GGA, but how does that lead to more equitable solutions to the climate crisis? Not just so we can go, we can tick off science, health, but we're actually having an outcome that is more effective, more equitable solution.
Yeah, look, I'm going to take this off because listening to your own voice is disturbing. We have just been discussing in a few different conversations about the GGA, about evidence-based accounting of emissions, about evidence-based accounting of adaptation progress. But one of the things where I think science can be the most helpful is in exposing issues of inequities that sometimes the political processes are really great at hiding under the carpet. We can look at minoritized communities, we can expose vulnerable populations through data, through the science. We can look at different vulnerable groups a lot more effectively than sometimes the political processes allow for. So there's a lot of opportunity for science to be much more sensitive to ensuring that, as we say, this healthier future for all is really for all, and that we're putting pressure through those scientific findings within the negotiations, unlocking perhaps some of the conversations that politically might get stagnated, but that when you put science and evidence into them, it helps up pressure otherwise. In the GGA in particular, there's a huge opportunity to ensure that when we talk about the global goal for adaptation, that adaptation is really protecting vulnerable populations, that when we define those indicators, the indicators are really sensitive to the progress that we need to see to ensure that health is protected from climate change, and that when we talk about NDCs, those NDCs are underpinned by evidence to monitor, to keep accountability mechanisms, and that we don't leave them off the hook with political statements, but actually going to the substance of the change that we actually need to see, keeping that scientific pressure from what is the evidence showing us, and we actually want to see the physical reduction of emissions, the physical improvement of air quality, the physical improvement of our health quality and our determinants of health altogether. So there's a lot of opportunities that as a scientific community we can help advance those discussions if and only if science is developed keeping in mind those political mechanisms that we need to empower rather than the impact factor of the papers that we're going to publish. And with that, I know that you're our funder, but I want to give a shout out to the Wellcome Trust, because the Wellcome Trust has a really revolutionary way of approaching funding for science, in which scientific projects are driven by action. There's a whole new framework that is being developed and empowering universities to support researchers also in producing research that, if it doesn't make the Lancet or Nature on Science, but it drives conversations here, that's just as valuable or even much more so. And I wanted to give a shout out to Wellcome for pioneering or really supporting that process.
Thank you. I will let the people who manage your grant know that you thanked us publicly. But I take that opportunity to say that when we promote our calls for research, they are research calls, but we want to fund partnerships between researchers and people who use it. So if you're here from a community, a community group or a policy institution, and you can see a research gap, you can partner with researchers, and we want to see those kinds of partnerships because, as my boss Alan likes to say, he doesn't really care if the research gets published in a major scientific paper. I mean, that's nice for you and nice for your career. He wants it to be in the hand of a policymaker. Cleo, I think if we could stick in the room, I think for a minute. Cleo, looking ahead to the Brazilian presidency, and we're sitting here in the UK pavilion, and we can actually see the Brazilian pavilion right next to us. I think they're talking about NDCs. They're going to be ramping up for COP30 very soon. What steps do you want to see the Brazilian presidency take to support the participation of Indigenous people at COP30 and to ensure that Indigenous knowledge is centred? And I think it's really vital for this year coming, but also we may well have a Australia and Pacific Islanders joint COP after that, and it's going to have to be important at any COP. It's important at this COP. It doesn't just matter it's Brazil. But yeah, what would you like to see the Brazilian presidency do?
Eu vou retirar aqui também porque é bem estranho.
So I'm going to take this off because it's right strange to hear your own voice. Well, I'm from a place, well, I'm here presenting 3 parts of the population which for a long time has been ignored, and that is the indigenous people, black women, and the scientists and art activists.
Diante do meu percurso acadêmico, eu tive que sair da minha aldeia para fazer.
I had to, in order to have my academic career, I had to leave my village in order to have my master's and work in research as a scientist, a researcher, to work directly with the population involved, and so with problems in health, human health, and also there was a climatic problem. For example, once we have to think of the greenhouse effect, and within this context, there are many things that we consider important. For example, scientists and indigenous people. My question is there's a word that's come up a lot in this COP, that is funding, and so we have to have funding to make sure that the indigenous youth are empowered, and these people must be empowered, as I said, and they have to have the right to participate. Faced with the indigenous people in Brazil, and from the articulation of a number of communities, we have seen there are some mechanisms that are very well thought out, so that there's a participation of indigenous people, that is to increase the number of credentials, to democratize events like COP and climate events. Not only climate events, for example, like the biodiversity is very important, and we know that the indigenous population has to be involved in these spaces. And one other thing that's very important is not to place these people only as observers, because I'm here as an observer. I don't have any access to negotiations, or I can't have access to any negotiator. It's very important to be here and to be part of this space, but it's not enough. It's not of any use to saying, okay, we'll put these people in these spaces, and not to see the mechanisms, not allow them to choose the mechanisms that will help them to decide. So, if I could to bring one very important point that has to be considered for COP30, I would say that the involvement of indigenous peripheral people, black people, to be in these spaces and to work, to be involved effectively so as their voices are heard. So we have to work, and we have to empower the youth, the populations, giving them information, democratizing them with knowledge in relation to climate changes, environmental education, promoting also the question of the translation of languages is a problem which has an impact. For example, I'm here, I could be expressing myself much better with you in English, but it would have a greater impact. But we are not taught languages, so we're not given this empowerment, so that is why we have to work, in fact, on empowering these populations and giving them financing. So this becomes a possibility, and so they have to be given voice and not be here just as observers. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Yes, you're right that engagement takes work. It's not simply a matter of opening a door, and it's really important, I think, particularly when we're looking ahead at COP that's overrunning, to reflect on the cost of participation and how expensive it is when it overruns for people, and that as the COP goes on, potentially some people will have to leave, and that limits who is here for the final decisions. And certainly those of us who've been here and people who are watching at home might have read about the cost of food here. I heard delegates talking about how they had to choose which meal they were going to eat. and it's much harder to participate when you're hungry. And so, yeah, the funding behind it and the infrastructure is so important. Moving over to Canada, so I said one of the reasons why this issue should always be talked about. It's being highlighted a bit with the Brazilian COP and for people looking ahead to the possibility of a Pacific Islanders one, but also it's the G20. The G7 is hosted by Canada next year, and that's one of the reasons for wanting to go to Canada and talk to Maria, but also that you have such an interesting job in that you are the Director of Indigenous Research for the Canadian Climate Institute. Maybe you could tell us a bit, from your very from that specialism, how can Indigenous knowledge systems be integrated into global or national policy or regional or local policy like you work in, making processes in a way that isn't extractive? Do you have any advice for anyone about what best practice could look like?
Complex question, but an important one. I think what I'd like to share is something that I hear a lot back home, and that is nothing about us without us. And what that means is that policy impacting Indigenous people must be led by Indigenous people. At the Canadian Climate Institute, we partner with the Centre for Indigenous Environmental Resources on an Indigenous Perspectives program. We have a national call for funding where we ask Indigenous authors, Indigenous leaders, knowledge holders, storytellers to share what's important and meaningful to them. And I think that's incredibly important. There's been way too long of a history of knowledge extraction in Indigenous communities, and I can only share my perspective as someone with some lived experience, but also working in this space. In terms of best practice, there's a lot of examples to draw from. In Canada specifically, the Assembly of First Nations has a guide for people looking to do work in a good way. There's an Inuit strategy on research. There's principles of ethical Métis research. There's also OCAP, the principles of ownership, control, access, and possession. And what is now known as Canada is home to over 630 First Nations communities that all require a distinctive-based approach. I think I heard Cleo say in your talk that it has to move beyond just observership. And I think having a seat at the table is not enough. It's actually about driving that agenda and driving what policymaking processes look like in a good way with elders and with youth, and thinking of future generations. Future generational thinking is very prevalent in Indigenous communities. And I really want to highlight folks that I know are at COP right now. Indigenous Climate Action, the only Indigenous climate organization in what is known as Canada, has a report called Decolonizing Climate Policy. And that's a really great place to start when looking for more information. And decolonizing doesn't have just a strict definition. It's about looking inward at yourself and being reflexive of who you are and how you do this work as policy decision makers. I know for myself, when I ask people if they know the history of even Canada, they often don't. They don't know all of the history. They don't know the impacts of residential school. Truth and Reconciliation really drew attention to that. And there is a commitment to reconciliation and to the implementation of UNDRIP within this country. And I think making sure that there is actionable, achievable measures put in place that build accountability and have impact is important to not be extractive. I'll stand there. Thank you.
Thank you. Lots of homework for reading in there. I will read that. Generally, because I'm thinking a lot about this issue at the moment. So there's lots of things to think about. And do we have Hugh ready? We do. Hugh.
I am here, yes.
Hello, Hugh.
I do. Can you hear me?
Yes.
I'm so pleased. Teams doesn't always work for me. So here I am in London. Sorry for the logistical and technical problems, but I am here now.
We're all at COP, so logistical and technical problems we're very used to.
Okay.
And it does feel kind of nice, if a bit weird, to be sitting in Azerbaijan with a red telephone box talking to someone in London. But have you been watching any of the COP? Did you have any highlights that have filtered through to you in London?
I've actually just been at Wellcome at an AMR antimicrobial resistance meeting where there was some talk, and it's also Global AMR Week as well. So there's really a lot. There's a lot happening, but certainly a lot of what we do at LSHGM, and particularly with the Pathfinder team, who I'm here representing, we're very aligned with what the previous couple of speakers, have been talking about around. I think what Robert Chambers, the noted development practitioner, calls being empowering and not extractive, and particularly with LSHGM Pathfinder, we know that there's a huge amount of evidence already out there about what works. And what we do is we collect those using a method called systematic review, and we say, we reach conclusions about what we can say is generalizable and what is a bit more context specific, what only works in particular places versus what might be more generally applicable on topics, whether it's climate change, adaptation, or actually mitigating greenhouse gas emissions. So what I was prepared to do, but since I'm so late, I'm not sure there's time now. I did want to talk about a couple of systematic reviews that we've done on trees.
I know. People keep telling me that nature hasn't been talked enough about at the COP, and it is actually striking. Yeah. There have been very few trees here, and we've actually got some lovely pictures of some trees around us. So please tell us about some science about trees.
Okay, all right then. So if you're happy for me to share my a slide deck, if you don't mind me doing that, I will do that quickly. But I will. I know I'm aware I've only got 5 minutes, so I will be within the time that has been allocated to me. So can you see my slides there?
Yes, and we were wanted to have scientist speakers, and what would be an event without scientist speakers and a lovely slide deck, so we can see it perfectly.
Absolutely right. So us academics, we love our slide decks. So I suppose, and I thank you very much for pointing out this idea that actually nature-based solutions are so fundamental. We think that in theory, what we do in systematic reviewing is we say, we collect the rigorous evidence and we basically answer questions about what works and why and for whom and in what context. So I'm going to briefly talk about a couple of systematics we've done on trees. So these are interventions that provide or promote trees. It might be like a protected area or a payment for ecosystem or environmental services, or building in methods, mangrove forestry in coastal areas to prevent disaster, flooding risk, or building tree breaks in forestries to prevent forest fires. And what do we know about the impacts of those interventions in low and middle income countries? Because it's in low and middle income countries where a lot of these locally based adaptations are happening, and this is what we should be evaluating, what is actually being done to either mitigate or in particular adapt to climate risk and disaster. Okay, sorry. Okay, so just kind of skipping over the background, basically what I'm talking about is nature-based solutions and particularly interventions in the area of trees. And we know that trees are central to landscape protection, restoration, sustainable management, and also reducing exposure to and hazards from natural disasters. So we can think of tree interventions as being nature-based solutions, and then when we're thinking about disaster risk, there's a terminology that we use in policy, ecosystem disaster risk reduction. I'm going to present two rapid reviews that we did with partners at the London School and at Campbell South Asia and the Lead Foundation. So this is what we found for nature-based solutions, and the most, I suppose, where we're coming from the Pathfinder perspective is that both climate and health that is planetary health and human health are fundamentally intertwined. And actually, if we can evidence the impacts of climate policies on health, or alternatively the impacts of health policies on climate, that's a way that we can get people to be engaged with, particularly with climate mitigating planetary breakdown and also disaster risk. So what we did was there was a review that was led by my colleague Penny Mirage, where we looked at these nature-based solutions. So basically protecting areas or using agroforestry and in payments for ecosystem services and others. And basically, so that review has what I'm showing here on the left-hand side is a forest plot. I'm sorry if you're not used to seeing a forest plot. Essentially, what we're looking for is we've got all of these individual interventions that have been conducted in different countries. So you've got Senegal, Niger, Mali, lots of studies which have actually been done in sub-Saharan Africa. And you'll see there's these horizontal lines which represent program impacts of studies in particular contexts, and then these diamonds that represent what we think is the most likely effect of this program across all these particular contexts. So what was very striking from this review was essentially that basically what we found the nature-based solutions, so providing trees, are effective in improving health outcomes like food security and other types of health outcomes, where there was a specific component of the intervention focusing on people's livelihoods. So in other words, so whereas we found protected areas and forest management intervention didn't tend to have, they were kind of food security neutral. If we wanted to promote both the tree growth but also human well-being outcomes, then there needed to be a component that focused on livelihood. So that's the kind of one key policy message from this study. So turning quickly to another,
I think we probably only have time for the one. Unless there's a particular, do you have a summary point about this one that you want to share?
I'm sorry for going on. Yes, I just wanted to say that trees are also incredibly cost effective. Like when we're providing, particularly like mangrove restoration, we see benefit cost ratios of like 68. That's 68 times the benefits given the costs that go into these programs. So they're just absolutely not only effective, but they're absolutely enormously effective in averting disaster, preventing mortality from disaster. So that's all I really wanted to say. So I think I'll stop presenting, and maybe I can return to some of these points in the discussion. Thank you.
Yeah, and that's actually a really good point to finish your bit on, because it has been quite striking how little nature has been discussed at this COP, especially as many people actually who are delegates here have also been at the COP16, the biodiversity COP, but certainly how much things cost has been a big topic of discussion, from the cups of tea to climate finance, and it's good that you're pointing out that even the really rigorous reviews of the science show the cost effectiveness of trees. Back to the room, Rio. We've had the presentation about science, and it's very easy for the scientists in the room to kind of go, and this is the science, but that's not enough politically, and there's so much more work that you have to do to put that in place. What, from you as someone who works in climate policy, what do you see as needing to be required globally to ensure that our response to the climate crisis actually meets the kinds of science that we see people like Marina or Hugh or others demand?
Yeah, thank you. I think that's a very important question, and just from the outset, would like to just acknowledge the Wellcome Trust and our friends here at UK Pavilion for having us and having me being part of this distinguished panel of speakers, both in person and virtually. I think from my end, it's a tricky one, because at the end of the day, climate change is a creature of science, as we all know, and for some of us as practitioners back at home, it's a challenge reconciling this process with implementation and the means of and mobilizing the means of implementation to drive what the science is telling us. So, as presented by the good professor, I think the science, the research, it's clear. The recent IPCC report speaks for itself. The recent UNEP emissions gap report speaks for itself. For us back at home in a small island country, or as the Prime Minister, Honorable James Marape, likes to call it, a big island state with small island neighbors, it's a challenge trying to mobilize support. That's probably one of the main reasons why why the Prime Minister didn't attend the COP, because he, in a way, sort of lost faith in the multilateral process that we work within. But the technical team, we're here to follow on from the discussions. The science and the means of implementation that's needed, I think for us, my take would be we need to come up with and this is commonly used as well, the whole of government approach, but I think it needs to be more than that. It needs to be a whole of stakeholder approach. And as my sister from Brazil said, the might and strength of the indigenous folks, the different groupings, the different minority groupings, the different partners, we all need to come to the table. I think for me, I've been privileged to serve on the Green Climate Fund board this year as an alternate board member. It gave me a first-hand insight into the nuances and the decision-making that goes with the allocation of resources. And what struck me was that, the Green Climate Fund has an indigenous policy. And so that indigenous policy is used to see how best indigenous knowledge can be mainstreamed into the decision-making process. So, for example, when you have a concept note or a project proposal, one of the key components is climate rationale. What's affecting your community? So obviously evidence-based, science, data, all of the above. And then you have the traditional indigenous knowledge component that also corresponds with the science. And for me, I think that's a powerful tool and a strong narrative, especially when you're talking about mobilization of resources and the acknowledgement of that source of information. So that's just a snapshot of what's happening at the funding level. But on the ground, for me, I'm pleased to say that the political support back at home has been consistent through that bipartisan approach. We've had the enabling environment with the policies and the legislations enacted to help drive our ambition to transition into a green growth, low carbon country. And it's, again, what's the diplomatic word for this? It's the challenge of putting together the commitments that's agreed to in this process with the means of implementation or the resources that's needed to drive some of the work moving forward. So, long story short, I believe that we need the science speaks for itself. The policies and the legislation corresponds with the science. It is now up to us to see how best we, as small island developing states, least developed economies, work with partners, developed economies to find those solutions moving forward. I note with interest as well that there's a new development in this COP with the mountain group of countries now seeking inclusion to be part of that special circumstances group of countries with like the SIDS and the LDCs. Again, that's just another example of how resource mobilization is a need and how different parts of the world are coming together to access that small funding envelope. And so, as I mentioned earlier, the discussions on finances will be interesting, and hopefully, fingers crossed, our leaders work overnight, burning that midnight oil, but coming up with a positive outcome to ensure that we are on track to meet that global goal under the Paris Agreement. Thank you.
Thank you. That was really brilliant. And I think it draws our attention to, where everyone's attention at the moment is very much on how much is that quantum, how much is that money, who is it coming from? But as you say, it's also about then there's many different challenges and then how it's distributed and thinking about the different communities that are affected and need that finance being taken to them, sent to them. Finally, we've got a kind of final question I'm going to ask everybody. We've heard President Lula branding COP30 as the turnaround COP. What are we going to need to see in the year ahead for that turnaround to happen? And I'm going to go first to the room, and then I'll go to Maria and Hugh on virtually. And also, just for people who are listening here with their headsets, if you're listening primarily in English and want the translation for Cleo in Portuguese, please stay on channel 0. What do we need to see this year if we're going to have that turnaround in a year's time in Belem? First, Marina.
I hadn't heard about the turnaround. I had heard about the People's COP, which sounds weird.
Okay, well, which do you prefer and what would you like?
I prefer the People's COP, but it sounds weird that we need a People's COP. And it reminded me of, we always joke that no one cares about polar bears. And everyone cares about polar bears, but no one actually cares as much as they care about their health and people's health. So putting people back at the center of that conversation is something that we've been kind of calling out for so long. And having a People's COP seems like, what were we doing all these 29 COPs before if it wasn't for the people? But the turnaround COP, I hadn't heard Lula saying that. I think, look, it's going to be the 30th, right? It's like 30th COP. We are entering the last half of this crucial decade to 2030. We've been negotiating processes and we've been negotiating targets and we've been negotiating commitments, but actually we need to see action. So one of the things that we're following really closely is, as I said before, the global goal on adaptation. What we're hoping to have next COP is those metrics that will keep countries accountable to ensure that people are being protected. I'm hoping that we won't have any more lingering of the quantified goal, that we will be able to solve the financial commitments in this COP. But if that doesn't happen here, then we need to see, and probably the onion approach that we're discussing will mean that we will need to see much more effective commitments next COP, and that some of the nuances of the practicalities of it will have to happen next COP. And it's just so fitting that it will happen in a country, as you said, Alice, that has kind of launched this whole process, in a country where the connection between human health and planet is so visible, so tangible, where you have so many indigenous communities that have so much knowledge that we have been ignoring systematically and that can come to the table. So hopefully this COP will pave the way. Next COP will be all about action and accountability.
Thank you. Cleo, what about you? What do you need to see if it's going to be the turnaround COP or the major event that we need?
É difícil falar depois dela, porque...
Well, it's difficult to say anything after her. She has already said everything. I think that... Okay. Yeah, it's fine.
Okay. Okay. Can you hear me? So I will speak in Portuguese, sorry.
So I'm going to speak in Portuguese.
Eu estou aqui enquanto uma organização
I'm here.
E a gente desenvolveu uma ação de ativismo. Não sei se alguns de vocês...
So we promoted an action, but we want to be more assertive. That is from the people from Belem, Pará. And so where is the next COP is going to be held. And so we have to look at the youth. And so keep your promises, COP30 for the people. And so, as communities, population, and so they are organizing themselves and to have a greater incidence of the civil population in next year's COP, a great number of indigenous people in this COP, and a great number of people from the country, from the periphery, and for people who, in fact, are affected by the decisions that are taken in COP. And so, then it's so with turning point COP, and so we hope that the agreements will be made, and so the countries will have an agreement of what they want to finance, and so we need a decision. And this is always pushing forward things to the next COP. But this COP now has, we're coming to the end of it, and I think that a lot of things are going to be pushed forward to COP30. And so COP30 has a lot in its hands, and that is why we call it the turning point COP, because it says that COP30 has got so much to do, and we hope that has solutions, and the solutions will be good for the people who suffer with the climate change, and for the and so basically, the turning point COP is for the people, because if there's no people, no population, a population that suffers, then it won't be a turning point COP. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Ruel, what about you? What do you want to see in the year ahead?
Yeah, that's. I think I agree with my two sisters here. I think the key point that was mentioned, accountability and implementation next year. I think that's an important point. I think Brazil, being one of the largest, forest basin countries and parts of the world, I think that speaks volumes. And obviously, you cannot meet the global temperature goal without forests. In order to do a nosedive, you need to conserve your forests. So financing for forests, nature-based solutions through partnerships with indigenous groups, harnessing of traditional knowledge, I think that'll be important. Obviously, that will hinge on the outcome of this process and the financing that goes with it, but I'm hopeful. You asked earlier about the highlight. Another highlight for me, fingers crossed, is the hosting for the year after Brazil, which is 2026, and Australia is bidding to host that one. They're calling it the Pacific Australia bid. So fingers crossed, if the bid does get announced or gets announced in the coming months, that can build on, again, the positive work from Baku and Belem. But all in all, that's sort of my hope going into the future.
Thank you. And then over to Canada. Maria, what do you want to see?
Thank you. I think a lot of fellow colleagues on this panel have said that, building accountability is incredibly important. When I think forward to COP30, I reflect on the situation I'm in right now. I've had my camera off for part of today because we had a bomb cyclone hit British Columbia, and the power has been predominantly out. Indigenous communities are at the forefront of responding to and acting for better climate change policies. And right now with this storm, access has been wiped out, medical situations are more dire. And I think it's very critical that Indigenous people set that agenda for the next COP, and that climate justice is a focus in that path forward.
Thank you. And I didn't realise we've been in such a COP bubble. I haven't been following the news. And thank you so much for attending when there are things going on locally. Hugh, what about you? What do you want to see in the year ahead?
Yes, okay. So I'd like to actually pick up on a point that was made by one of the other panelists, who, so I think it was Raoul, said science speaks for itself. And I'd like to kind of push back on that actually what we want to see is engagement by scientists with policymakers. I don't think science speaks for itself. There's a lot of there's a phrase going around that dissemination is dead, that what I'm doing here, which is presenting findings from reviews we've done, it's unlikely to make a big difference to decision making. What we need is in order to be empowering rather than extractive, and I'm talking about decision makers, whether they're people living in communities in parts of Africa, or whether they're sitting at the top of the intergovernmental panels, is engagement by scientists with methods like systematic evidence that, and as another panelist said, puts health at the centre of climate action. And so over the next year, we're hoping to see more engagement to demand-driven research. So one of these studies on ecosystem disaster risk reduction was actually commissioned research by the UK government and is now being used in cross-governmental decision-making. And we need more responsive research which addresses questions which are actually relevant for.
Thank you. Yeah, I'd sometimes when I hear the phrase "science speaks for itself," I kind of really understand where it comes from. But I also know quite a lot of scientists that sometimes need help speaking and also listening, which is part of it too. So, does anyone in the room have any questions? We have a bit of time for some audience questions.
Thank you. Great panel. Thank you so much for the great presentation. On the point about the science speak for itself, I would actually dispute that because of the fact that to us it does, but to the general public, I think there's still a huge gap. And if you look at what happened in the U.S. election most recently, and how people are not able to understand what the government is doing and the good work that's being done, people vote based on other things because they don't get it. And so I really would like to say that to make science into, I would say, bite size, to make it so easy, not only like we're used to word dumb down, because that seems very pejorative, but the term is really trying to make it much more easily understandable so that folks who are going to be leaders is able to promote those issues in order to make sure that the science really is there and that people really understand it, and we're not creating different level of understanding. And so at the end of the day, when election comes, they go the wrong way. Thank you.
Do any of the panelists want to respond to that? Do you have any thoughts on ways in which scientists could engage more effectively with the public in the next year?
I absolutely agree with both of you. Science, sometimes we get quite technical. We get into our kind of papers and graphics, and sometimes it's quite inaccessible. Even the simplest graphic is sometimes quite inaccessible. It also has happened a lot. I've been following, so Twitter has become really interesting. Oh my goodness, Twitter, what happened?
I thought everyone had left it.
Well, I haven't. I'm actually having a blast there. I'm being insulted left, right, and center. But one thing that is really interesting is there's this graph of global mean temperatures since kind of going hundreds of millions of years back into the past, and people saying, well, the planet is as cool as it has ever been, and we've always seen these peaks, and it's like, yeah, of course, there were no humans or life in the planet back then. So. And science can be so easily manipulated. You see a graph, and the fact that people just would trust any graph because it looks like science is really dangerous. And I kind of agree, but kind of disagree with what you're saying as well, because I don't think the problem was that we haven't communicated the science effectively. I think the science has been communicated effectively, but we haven't been able to understand how people respond to the science. And people, I think they understand the science, but they also understand their priorities, and how to choose the evidence that they decide to accept has a lot more to do with kind of personal circumstances and personal priorities and personal struggles that we haven't been able to properly acknowledge in the way that we're engaging. So I think there's a lot of science that happens in the social sciences of how do you engage, how do you empower people, how do you kind of tap onto the social sciences and understand these social movements and social tipping points that we haven't effectively connected with as researchers. And there's a lot of very interesting insights of how to do what we're doing a lot better and with a lot more awareness of the social circumstances under which we make our decisions for life.
Anybody?
Muito importante essa pergunta, muito importante esse
So
questionamento.
this question is very important.
Só comentar algo que
I would
uma das coisas que me fez ir
just
pro
like to
ativismo,
say
sair da
that
academia,
one
pro
of
ativismo,
the things that made me leave academia to become activism because because I understood that my research was sort of closed in the lab, and so I wanted to go out and see that there's public health and how that affects the climate. So I wanted to leave the lab and I wanted to leave the papers to go out and be to an activist and to work on the scientific knowledge and on the ground. And so my life changed as a person and as a scientist because I see my work in a different way. It doesn't have meaning to carry out research, and the people who are being affected by this research.
Eu acredito que divulgação científica deveria ser trabalhada na graduação.
Should be worked in all courses because we don't know how to make it understandable in terms of what we're researching. So we have to do this properly. And so I, as a scientist, I would just like to say thank you very much for the question.
Thank you. I can see that Hugh has got his hand up, and then we want to have a bit more time for more audience questions. So quickly, Hugh, and then we'll move on to another question.
Yes, thank you. So I just wanted to feed back in this point about putting health front and centre of what we're doing. So I mentioned this planetary and human health being kind of very closely intertwined. Think about actions to reduce air pollution. They reduce greenhouse gas emissions, also have important evidence benefits on people's health. There's lots of areas, diets, active transport, lots of areas where there's a close link, a close link between health and planetary health, human health and planetary health. And the point is that these health impacts are often in the near term, and they happen to people, their families, and communities, and people care about their health, and they notice when their health improves or deteriorates. So evidencing these health impacts and providing information about them to populations, we think will make a difference. But the important thing is about communicating, and we need to use different ways of engaging with stakeholders and communicating what the evidence is. And that's where we're going to be focusing some of our work over the next year or so.
Thank you.
Try and improve that.
I think we've got a question over here. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you so much. My name is Loria, current master's student at the University of Edinburgh under the MasterCard Foundation. I just want to echo on what he asked, comment on that I think also a better way for us to do is bringing maybe youths from indigenous communities to get more scientific knowledge and take back to their communities. I'm speaking this from a point of experience, like what MasterCard Foundation did to us. I am from an indigenous community, and bringing me to the UK to get a better knowledge around food security so that I can take it back in a local language to my own people, integrate it with our traditional elders' knowledge in the community. It will be easier for us to get it down on the grassroots levels for these our own communities. Right now, we're really struggling like with the loss of like indigenous crops, for example. How do we ensure as indigenous communities that we, within the food systems, we do not lose our own foods? Amidst all this, we still protect our own biodiversity. So if you can bring like youths and empower them on the education line, and there we go back and speak to our own people and our fellow youths to integrate this in our own systems, then we can really protect the ecosystems within the indigenous communities. Thank you.
I was going to join the round of applause, but I was holding the thing. Thank you. That was great, and it was it kind of touched on something I was surprised hadn't come up earlier. Is it's not just how you do the science or how you communicate it, but who does it, and it's one of the problems that we need, and certainly us at Wellcome, and I know many others. It's not just us. Have been trying to work on, which is that science is too often done by a very small set of people in the world, and if science is really going to see the world in its full detail, it's going to need the full diversity of humanity to see it, and that's one of the reasons why people don't listen to scientists always, because scientists don't look like them and don't talk in the same way as them and understand them and don't listen. So sorry, I got a bit personal there, but thank you very much. Is there any other responses to that question from anybody here or online?
I could add just to absolutely agree with you that we've done a study of scientific publications looking at the location of the study and the lead author. They're all being led by researchers in the global north, and the vast majority of the studies are not in the most affected places. Africa is a huge gap. So we've even been trying to develop, and with the Lancet Countdown, we're going to open a center in Africa that, just to flag, we have an opening for a director for that center. So if you know good researchers there, please help us spread the news, because we really want a good network of very good scientists in Africa to help expand that. But we're really struggling, and sometimes it comes to the fact that there's not enough critical mass of funding and resource for people to be able to dedicate to study these issues. And I know that Wellcome is working also on developing a kind of research centers in Africa that will be hugely helpful. In South America, where I'm from, we had a similar problem. We operate generally through a system of kind of reaching out to networks and building networks of scientists that can contribute. Scientists in low-income countries depend on their day-to-day grants, depend on the day-to-day finance. So it's really difficult to operate in the way that we're used to operating from our hub in London and through our global collaboration on a voluntary, mostly voluntary basis. So there's a big shift, I think, needed in the way that we do science as a whole. And the other thing I would like to say that I think it also relates a lot to what happens with indigenous communities and also with many LMICs is that the language barrier is huge. Much of the best research being published in Argentina does not get published in English. It gets published in our medical journals, in our local journals, and that's the best science that we have. And that does not get picked up. And Spanish is generally quite widespread. Imagine when you're talking about an indigenous language or a local language of a local community. So there's a big barrier also in the way that we've done international research, that we need to rethink how we can access that knowledge that is sometimes held on the ground.
Anybody else want to add anything?
Yeah, just a quick one while the opportunity is here. I think that's a very important point, and I agree as well. Just Article 12 of the Paris Agreement touches on that, on capacity and research. And in country, that's something that needs to be harnessed. In Australia, for example, the firefighters, for example, one of the methods for fighting fires that was taken from the indigenous Aboriginal people, which was the burning of small little fires to, stop the big fire from coming in. I mean, that when I heard about that, I thought that was powerful. The harnessing of indigenous knowledge to be put into practice. So from a research standpoint as well, back at home, there's a number of universities that's now having dedicated schools targeted at consolidating and putting a repository of knowledge from the elders and having that transcribed and having that worked and woven into the current curriculum. I think there's a lot of promise there, and I think if that support is given, I think that should be mainstream. And I think, as mentioned, those different pockets of information from the different parts of the world, if that can be streamlined, that will go a long way. Perhaps a entry point for AI to fast track the translation process. I don't know, but we need to create that community of practitioners to ensure that that information is flowing.
I was about to say, I think we have time for one more question. Somebody at the back? Yeah, do.
Yeah, thanks. I recognize the panelists. I think it's an excellent presentation. I think it's very timely in terms of what we're experiencing at this COP. And the conversation around science is an interesting one. We can speak on it on more than anything. It's not a question, but more commentary. I think that the mechanism that is UNFCCC, the modalities that exist and the streams, and I think it's a work in progress. And I agree with your contribution in that recently or now we're seeing another group, the Mountain, and before it was like-minded. It's growing, and it's happening for a reason. We're talking about the 30th COP coming on board. You can't fix an issue. The Green Revolution is over 60 years old. You can't fix an issue when we have made many mistakes as humankind. We've done so many injustices and made so many mistakes. It's difficult to say that 30 years will be sufficient to fix most of these issues. In fact, we have the UN General Assembly. We can't address many of the global issues. And it's the same construct where you have a unification of parties, of governments, of scientists, and everybody trying to get things right. And it's difficult, but there's a lot of optimism in seeing the interest and the growing interest. I looked at an interview the other day, and I saw professors at universities who had come to the first and the second COP and said they gave up. They didn't do the third up to the 12th, and then they returned again. And I'm thinking a lot of us young people, I'm not young, but a lot of young people will undergo some of the same transition as well, where there is a haste or there's this eagerness to see a transition, but it takes time. Why? Because we're people, we're dynamic, we're social, we're emotional, and then AI adds to the conversation. So it's going to be interesting to see where we go in the next 10 years or the next 30 years. But there's a lot of optimism in seeing experts like yourselves. And I really do like the professor on his research with nature and health component, because we've done nature and health at within the agrarian concept. We've seen where trees and animals, and we've seen the engagement of that, how it has added to livelihood and livelihood protection and health, food security and feed security, for example, for rural communities or for small livelihood households. And so looking at returning to these sciences and improving on these sciences and then applying on these will be very positive for most of us who would really like to see a transformation and a transition in this world. And I think I'd like to end up by saying let's encourage each other, encourage developing countries to recognize our voices, because that's the most important thing. The individual voices and the protection of the individual voice that this construct has allowed. UNFCCC has allowed for that protection and insurance. And so we ought to be pleased about that. We come from different governance systems where some systems have not allowed for the protection of those voices or for the valuing of those voices. But this contract has done so under conservation, here at climate change, and soon under desertification. So let's be encouraged and let's continue to work with each other and let's have patience. So I really appreciate your presentation from the experts.
Thank you so much. That's quite a positive way of ending things at a point at the COP where lots of us are starting to feel less than positive and wondering about uncertainty. But you're right, it does take time. Somebody at the beginning, when I first arrived, said to me, it's COP29, we need to stop having COPs. And this person worked for the WHO, and I said, you've been having World Health Assemblies for over 70 years and you haven't got universal health coverage. It doesn't mean we don't stop going, and we still keep going, and we can speed up action because we do need, climate change it demands speed. But on that note, on time, I'm going to finish with the panel, and I'd like to ask everyone to give them a huge round of applause. When I saw the panelists, I was really excited, and they have really just they've surpassed any of my expectations, and we've had such interesting contributions from the floor as well. So can everyone give them a big round of applause? Thank you. We're going to end with another film, this time showcasing climate and health impacts from around the world. And it does, because we are going to be looking forward to COP30, the Brazilian COP, it does also include some communities in Brazil. Thank you. Sorry, we are about to show it, I promise.
I want to talk to you about the effects of climate change on me as a mother, and especially on these lovely boys who are sound asleep. Because the heat waves are intolerable. You can even get temperatures as high as 40 degrees in the eastern region of Ghana, where it used to be so cool all day and all night. It's wet. See it? This is a cool night. So imagine a night where the heat wave is on.
Nós estamos aqui há aproximadamente 30 dias realizando um combate muito difícil, né? Fogo de alta intensidade, muitos animais morrendo, muitas plantas medicinais, infelizmente desaparecendo. Estamos destruindo aquilo que nos é um pilar para nos manter bem aqui nessa terra. Então,
what we are seeing right now in our community, most of the places have been submerged by flooding water. Hunger, malnutrition becomes the order of the day. In these events, there is nothing to eat, there is nothing to feed the kids. Me, I can go a day without food, but to the child, that impact is so much. What is worrying me is this is becoming normal. These outbreaks of diseases, the cholera, the typhoid, is becoming normal.
ড্রেনের পানি, জোয়ারের পানি, সমস্ত এক হয়। আমার খুবই কষ্ট লাগে যে এই আবহাওয়া পরিবর্তন এরকমের কেন, এটার কোনো শেষ নেই। আমাদের প্রজন্মের যে ছেলেমেয়েরা আছে তারা, আমরা যা দেখেছি তারা আদৌ সেটা দেখতে পারতেছি না।
এই পানি উঠলে আমরা সরকারি রূপে বসে থাকতে একটু ভালো লাগে না। পানি না থাকলে আমরা খেলতাম না, দুইজনে এখানে বসে থাকতে আমাদের একটু ভালো লাগে না, আমাদের এই জীবন ভালো লাগে না।
সারাদিন ডরে ডরে খাই, মাইয়ে দুইটা হাটে চলে, জোক সাপ এটা সেটা, এই রাইতে ঘুমাইনে ডরে, সব পোক জোক সব চবিতে উঠতে থাকে, মাইয়ে গো কানে যায় না, না হে যায়, এই ডরে ডরে থাকে।
I was looking out at this lake when I was breastfeeding my first daughter and realized that she was going to be affected by climate change. I had known by then that climate change was going to lead to wildfires and asthma, and I'd taken care of children on a malnutrition project in Africa and been really affected by that, but I hadn't realized that climate change was going to affect my own daughter. At that moment, I really felt very alone. I felt a lot of uncertainty about what I should do.
I get worried for my children. If these heat waves continue now, with no drastic change, with no action from us, what happens to our children in 5 years from now, in 10 years from now?
What are we looking for, Ada?
Creatures.
Creatures. The loss of my daughter's future, the loss of my future is a lot to hold in your mind. And the only way that I've found to kind of come to terms with that is to really face it, face on, accept that that is the reality and that's what's facing us, and then try and make changes. I mean, I'm trained to look and act on emergencies, and you don't tackle emergencies with tinkering around the edges. You need to act decisively, and you have to make big changes, and you have to tackle it head on. And I don't see any of that happening at the moment.
Nós dependemos da natureza porque ela nos dá alimento, ela fornece remédio, né? Ela faz o filtro, né, das impurezas, né, de emissões, assim como a gente cuida de quem a gente ama muito.
Even though I'm seeing all these impacts, even though I see all these communities suffering, I still feel hope. I still feel it's not too late.
We can make changes, huge societal changes. I've seen that happen in this last year working in the COVID pandemic. We all came together as a society to protect each other, and we need to kind of do that now, but with climate change.
So what are you going to tell your classmates when you go to school on Monday?
Then planted some trees.
Okay, good.
And then we grow it.
It feels so good to be taking action and making a difference. It feels good to know that we are not the only people doing this.
This pandemic has brought home to many of us what's important. And so not only do we know what's important, but we know how to change things. And really, it's that thought that I'm alive at this moment in time. What a privilege to be able to be here, to be able to do things that can affect health not only now, but also into the future. I can't think of a better way to spend a life.